Hey friends, welcome back to my sourdough mini series. If you are just watching this video for the first time, I encourage you to go back and look at video number 1 where I introduce you to what I'm going to be teaching you through this little mini series, and I teach you how to create your own sourdough starter. We talk all about that, so go watch that video if you haven't. Hopefully you're here from that video and you're ready to move on to your next step, which is maintaining your sourdough starter. If you're new here, hello, my name is Rainbow. I don't think I actually introduced myself in the first video, but that's okay. I'm going to be teaching you guys my personal method for sourdough as a busy mom who doesn't have hours to spend in the kitchen every day. So if that's for you, an uncomplicated, non-gatekeeping way to sourdough just to feed your family a loaf of bread, then this video series is definitely for you. So we're gonna start talking as if you already have a nice, healthy sourdough starter happening, it is mature, and you've maybe already tried baking your first loaf of bread. Now let's talk about how to feed and maintain your sourdough starter. So here we have our sourdough starter that we just started in my last video. It's just a baby. And here is my lovely sourdough starter that is years old, going strong. I have quite a bit because I do bake with the discard and things like that. This video is going to be quick because I keep things very simple when it comes to feeding your sourdough. I don't have a lot of time every day to work with, so everything needs to be quick, easy, and I need to be able to do it while I'm making breakfast and dealing with my kids and animals and everything else. So if you watched my first video, then you already know my formula to feeding, and we're just gonna chat about it a little bit more. So to start, I'm gonna talk to you guys really quickly about my 2-jar method. I recommend having 2 jars on hand for your sourdough starter. Normally a clean jar, but I literally am just filming all of these in one morning. So this is the sourdough starter that we just started in the first video. I had to scrape it. Normally this is a clean jar, just trust me on that. So the reason I do a 2-jar method is because every day that you feed, I like to put it into a clean jar and then immediately wash the other jar, because like I warned you in the last video, anything your sourdough starter touches will turn to glue. Sourdough starter is very, very sticky once it's dry. It's one of the hardest things to get off of everything. So make sure you just rinse it really well. The reason I like to switch between the 2 clean jars is because it just prevents bacteria growing on that buildup. Sometimes people come into an issue where the sides of their jars where sourdough has risen and fallen and scrapings, it's inevitable to have some sourdough on the sides of your jar. And this method of switching it to a clean jar every single day, it just prevents mold and bad bacteria from building up on the outside of or the inside of your jar where your sourdough's not touching, and then contaminating your sourdough and potentially wrecking your sourdough or just making it more complicated for you. So I really personally recommend doing 2 jars. So let's say your sourdough is established. Okay, it's time to go feed your sourdough. All you're gonna do is you're gonna put the stuff you're gonna feed, just pour it into your new jar and feed it as normal. Again, it's not complicated. We're just preventing bacteria from spreading on your jar. And then just wash your other jar right away. Okay, so let's take you down to the tabletop, the counter, and I will feed the sourdough with you. Okay, so we're gonna use this jar that I just scraped some new. Again, normally this would be a clean jar, but I used this in my last video, which was just a couple minutes ago for me. And I still need to use my sourdough for these instructional videos. So I'm just gonna put a little bit of sourdough starter into my clean jar. This is my mature starter. Just a couple scoops is all I need. I'm not gonna tell you guys exactly the amount I'm using because I'm just eyeballing it, but it doesn't matter because you should be working with a sourdough starter that you have discarded half of and you're left with whatever's left. So just to show you though, I just put about 2 heaping scoops in the bottom of this jar. And that's totally enough to feed this. Because the less starter I have in this jar, the less hungry it's going to be, the longer it's going to take the bacteria to build up. So if I have a huge jar of sourdough starter like this, where I'm not discarding anything because I'm gonna bake with it or something, I'm gonna have that bacteria build up a lot faster because there's more of it to eat my feed, if that makes sense. Hopefully that's very clear. Because you can bake bread every day if all you have is a mature starter in here and then just the scrapings on the edge of your jar is enough bacteria to just feed it feed those scrapings, scrape it all down, and the next day you'll still have good sourdough to bake with. Okay, maybe I'm getting ahead of myself. You're gonna feed it with the same method I taught you to start your own starter with, which is 1/4 cup of filtered water. It is really important to use filtered water because your tap water can have contaminants in it, so it can have chemicals like chlorine, fluoride, that can kill and harm the bacteria in your starter. So use some filtered water, and always put the water in first because it just makes this a lot easier to mix. And then we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna put 6 tablespoons of flour in. 1, 2. Some people will insist that you need to stir the water into your sourdough starter first. Again, this is a no fuss, busy mom method. We don't need to do that. I just do it like this, and I've been baking bread for years. It's totally fine. Take a spoon, a clean spoon, but this is my sourdough spoon, and just give it a mix until all the flour and water is combined. You might have to really scrape the bottom just to get that starter in with the other stuff. And this is what's called a feed. We have fed the starter now. Just to show you the consistency, we are doing that brownie batter, goopy, kind of thick, but not so thick that it's totally oatmeal. Hopefully you can see in there. And it's lumpy, and there's flour chunks in there. That's exactly what you want because that is what that bacteria is going to eat. If you have a clean finger, you can go ahead and scrape this, but just know that if your fingers are not clean, you will introduce bacteria into your sourdough, which could be a bad thing, potentially. It could create mold. But again, you don't have to worry about it too much because you have to have pretty dirty fingers for that to happen. Then just take a spatula and scrape down the sides of your sourdough starter jar. Replace the lid or the cloth and the lid if you're using something like this, a jar like this. And there we go. You have just fed your sourdough starter, and you can put it aside till morning. That is going to rise and fall. Tomorrow morning, you're gonna wake up with a really nice rise and fall line like we talked about in the last video. And that's it. That's how you feed and maintain your sourdough starter. It is really easy. Don't let anybody tell you it is more complicated. You can make bread. Seriously, even if you've never baked, you're a horrible baker. I truly believe that you can make sourdough bread and you can be successful at feeding your family fresh bread every day if that's your plan. Let's talk about a couple points really quickly here. Remember, a more active sourdough means more feeding is required. If my house is really hot, or if I live in a hot climate and not the cold Canadian climate that I live in, and my sourdough starter is rising and falling in just a few hours, maybe in 6 hours, I would be required to feed my sourdough morning and night instead of just every 24 hours. You might have to feed it every 12 hours. I think most people can get away with just feeding every 24 hours, but definitely if you've noticed like, oh wow, my sourdough starter really grows really fast, maybe it's overflowing over your jar, you might have to feed your sourdough starter a little more often. But just know that it is always better to underfeed your sourdough starter than it is to overfeed. Because when we overfeed our sourdough starters, you're basically diluting that yeast that you've worked so hard to create. You want to wait until that sourdough starter is active, it's bubbly, it's risen and fallen, it's giving you that slide line before you feed it again. So if you, for example, might take a little longer than 12 hours, because maybe your climate is just really cold, you have a drafty house, and you're struggling to keep your sourdough warm enough in the winter, you might have to wait a couple more hours before you feed it because you don't want to dilute that yeast. If you have no plans to bake with your sourdough every day with your starter, and it's just too much starter for you, say you want to bake once a week, once your starter is mature and you've already matured it, I would feed it every day for a couple weeks before I did this. I would let it really grow and mature. But let's say you're not interested in baking daily bread, or you're going on vacation, or you're going on a little holiday, or you won't be home and you're going to miss feeding it. If you're gonna miss it by more than a few hours, then I would suggest putting it in the fridge. And you can refrigerate it. Some people bake like this all the time. I personally don't, because I bake with mine every single day. or at least every other day or something, I'm available to feed it every day. If you are not and you don't want to bake that often, then what you would do with your mature starter is you would just feed it like I taught you, and then you would put it in the fridge, and it can sit there for up to a week. Check on it at day 5 or 6 just in case. If it's looking like really starved, then you might need to feed it. But you can kind of abandon your sourdough for a little bit. Some people can say that they can leave it in the fridge for like a month without feeding it. I have never had that success personally. If I leave mine more than a week, I will lose my sourdough starter because it will mold. And once you've had mold, there's no going back. That's my opinion anyway. You're gonna get a lot of opinions on sourdough, you will find. But from my knowledge and experience and what I know about sourdough and baking bread is that once you have mold in your sourdough starter, it is time to throw it out and start again. But that is exactly why we're doing things to prevent mold, like switching between the clean jars every day to make sure that your sourdough starter doesn't mold. So if you're going away or you're not interested in baking every day, you can just feed your sourdough. Feed it first, put it in the fridge, take it out, feed it, leave it on the counter for 24 hours, feed it again, and then 24 hours sits again, then it should be ready to bake with. So that's what you can do if you go on holiday or a vacation, or you just don't want to bake every day, or you don't want to have to feed it every day. But I would wait until you have a pretty mature starter to put it in the fridge, because the cold is just going to slow the bacteria process, and the bacteria growth is all you're doing. So it just takes the bacteria a lot longer to eat that food that you've given it, that flour and water. All right, my friends, I hope you found this video helpful. This is how you feed and maintain your sourdough starter. Look out for video number 3 coming at you in the next 2 days, which will be my 30-minute of hands-on bread making method for busy moms. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.